The sky hadn't cried over Ghost Hollow in 18 months, and Miriam Delaney had stopped waiting for it to start. Most folks who stayed in the territory learned to stop asking for mercy. The land didn't much care for prayers, and the heavens, far as Miriam could tell, had gone stone deaf. Still, every evening before she barred the door and raked the last coals beneath the hearth, she lit the porch lantern and left it burning until morning. Not because she was waiting for anyone, but because it was what Thomas used to do. And in this place, where memories clung tighter than the air, rituals mattered more than sense. Her husband had once said that kindness was a kind of rain, gentle, quiet, and rare. He also said it had a way of vanishing when you needed it most. Thomas was buried now, high on the ridge above the house, under a stone she'd carved herself with a chisel and calloused hands that no longer trembled. There hadn't been anyone left to help by then. Just the wind, the heat, and the creak of the front gate that never did latch properly. Ghost Hollow was what the map had called it. Some fool cartographer must have thought it poetic. But these days, it was literal. No wagons came through, no traders stopped to barter, and the old telegraph lines had long since gone silent. A graveyard of wooden shells and hollow porches, where the only movement came from lizards sunning on clapboards or the occasional hawk drifting overhead, waiting for something else to die. Miriam stood on her porch in the blue light before dawn, her eyes narrowed against the dry wind that carried dust more than scent. She wore her husband's old duster now, patched at the elbows, stiff at the cuffs. The sleeves were too long, and she rolled them just once each morning, never twice. Across the yard, the Appaloosa pawed half-heartedly at the earth. Samson, her last companion. The once proud gelding had gone rib-thin. His coat had dulled from storm gray to the color of ash, and one of his hooves cracked at the edge from the months without rain. "Not long now, old man," she said, walking slowly to his corral. Her boots kicked up powder, no longer dust. Dust meant there had once been moisture. This was worse. Dead earth, powdered and crumbling. "We'll give it one more week, if nothing changes." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Samson huffed and pressed his nose gently to her shoulder, a weight that made her knees soften for a second. She poured the last of the water into his trough. It barely covered the bottom. Back inside, the house held the kind of silence that pressed in from all sides. The log walls still smelled faintly of juniper and cooked beans, though both were fading. Miriam stirred the fire to life with careful hands, adding one stick of kindling, then a second. No more than that. There'd be no fresh-cut wood this season. Her stores were nearly gone, and the neighbors, those that remained, had taken their axes and gone east months ago. The stew pot held only beans and the memory of vegetables. She added a pinch of salt, stirred clockwise like Thomas used to do. Across the room, his rifle remained mounted above the door, still oiled, still loaded. Below it hung their wedding portrait, daguerreotype faded and cracked, showing a woman with dark hair pinned beneath a lace veil, standing beside a man whose eyes had laughed more than his mouth did. "You always said the rains would come," she murmured. "Still waiting, Thomas." Her voice sounded strange in the room. Hollow. She spoke less these days. The land didn't answer back, and Samson preferred quiet company to chatter. On days like this, when the heat pressed against the windows before breakfast, Miriam wondered if she too had become a ghost, haunting a home no one remembered. She sat with her bowl of stew, chewing each bite slowly, as if speed might waste it. Her hands had a tremor now, not from weakness, but from the way stillness crept into her bones. A month ago, she'd cut herself mending the gate, and the wound had taken nearly 2 weeks to close. Age, she figured. Or maybe the land was simply taking longer to let things heal. By the time the sun had risen fully, she had swept the porch, checked the empty rain barrel, and laid out 2 cloths to dry. though what they'd been washed in, only she knew. She thought about writing a letter to her sister in Montgomery Parish, but paper was too precious to waste on words she wouldn't send. Evening came, and the sky burned orange behind the ridgeline, a mocking flame that gave no warmth. Miriam stood with her hand on the porch rail, watching the last of the sun dip below the hills, same as she did each night. The shadows stretched long across the dirt, making every crack in the earth look like a wound. In the distance, the wind changed direction. She could tell by the way it rustled the dead orchard trees, a shift eastward, bringing with it the cold scent of stone and dry creeks. That's when Samson cried out. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the stillness like a rifle crack. Miriam froze, listening. Samson never called out at night, not unless something was wrong. She moved quickly, grabbing Thomas's rifle from its mount, her steps silent as habit. Her eyes scanned the yard from the edge of the doorframe. The corral was intact. The horse paced, ears forward, tail twitching. But someone, moved near the outer fence. Not a coyote, too tall, and not moving right. Her breath caught. "Who's there?" Her voice rang across the yard, sharp as frost. "I'm armed. I won't hesitate." No answer, just the figure staggering once, then collapsing in a heap beside the fence. She waited, counting to 20. No movement. Lantern in one hand, rifle in the other, Miriam stepped out into the dusk. The figure lay still. Limbs tangled in the dirt, one arm stretched toward the corral. The light caught bronze skin, long black hair matted with dust and blood. Not a settler. Apache. Miriam's heart beat hard against her ribs. Thomas had dealt fair with the tribes, but others hadn't. Since the drought, desperation had made men mean. She'd heard whispers from traveling merchants, attacks, reprisals, families gutted in their own homes. But this man hadn't attacked. He'd fallen, like the land itself. The blood at his side was dark, sticky, not fresh but not old either. A bullet wound left untended. She could go back inside, bolt the door, wait. He might die by morning, or he might not. A soft sound escaped him. Not a word, not a cry, just breath, ragged and shallow. Miriam knelt, slow as gravity, laying the rifle beside her. She touched his neck, hot with fever, skin slick. His pulse trembled like a trapped animal's. She whispered something, she didn't know what, and took hold of his arm. The dead weight of him pulled on her back, but she'd carried heavier. She dragged him inch by inch toward the cabin, past the porch steps, and inside. He didn't wake, didn't speak, just breathed. She laid him before the hearth, unwilling to give him Thomas's bed, but unable to leave him on the cold floor. She built the fire back up, water hissing in the kettle. She stripped the cloth from his side, wincing as the wound came into view. Infected, raw, yarrow, whiskey, needle and thread. Her hands moved without asking permission. She worked through the night, spooning water past his lips, dabbing his forehead, whispering curses and comfort in equal measure. By dawn, she'd poured water past his cracked lips, used half her herbs, and cursed the day she ever learned compassion. She sat back, sweat slicking her temples, her shirt damp with heat. Outside, the wind began to stir, carrying with it the sound of dust brushing against the dry siding of the house. She didn't know who he was, what he wanted, or if he'd live. She only knew that she had nothing left to give, and gave anyway. "God help me," she whispered, as she dragged him toward the warmth of her fire. "Or don't. I'm doing it anyway." The man hadn't stirred in hours, save for a twitch of his fingers now and again, small spasms that told her the fever hadn't let go. Miriam sat on the stool near the hearth, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands aching from stitching and cleaning. Her needle, dulled from years of mending shirts and saddlebags, had held its own against the torn flesh, but barely. The whiskey bottle lay empty on the floor beside a blood-stained rag. She hadn't taken a sip for herself. Outside, the desert was already stretching into its breathless summer rhythm. Sunlight crept over the ridgeline, lighting the world not with warmth, but interrogation. The house grew hotter with every tick of the clock, though there was no clock here anymore. Not since it broke the winter Thomas died. Her husband's words echoed again, unbidden. Kindness is like water. Give too much of it, and you'll have none left for yourself. He'd said it to her once when they found a wounded fox caught in their coop. Miriam had nursed it for a week, only for it to disappear the first night the door was left unlatched. She hadn't forgotten, but some lessons never truly held. Now the fox was a man, and her last reserves were dwindling. The spring was bone dry. Her food would not stretch beyond a fortnight, and she just sent her only horse away to save a stranger. She pushed herself to her feet, knees aching. The basin by the hearth needed refilling, and the closest barrel sat half full, if she was generous in her estimate. She carried the bucket out in the morning stillness, the porch boards creaking beneath her step. The horizon shimmered already, pale as bone. Ghost Hollow was quiet, save for the wind ticking through the empty corral. Samson was gone. Sent east toward Copper Creek with a silent prayer and saddle instructions tied around his neck. The old horse knew the route. Whether the town still stood was another matter. Her fingers brushed the gatepost as she passed, feeling the splintered wood. A habit now, unconscious, like counting the paces to the barn, like glancing toward the ridge to make sure Thomas's grave still held. Rituals, more than hope. Back inside, she wrung the cloth and pressed it to the stranger's brow. The man murmured something in his own tongue, a word she didn't know, but it sounded like pain wrapped in apology. His face was young, though his eyes, when they opened briefly, had the weight of too many years. High cheekbones, wind-burnt skin. Apache, surely. Or part. She knew the bone lines well. Thomas had done business with them back before the rail cut through the mountains, and people stopped needing wagons. She leaned back and stared at the beams above her. One was marked with a nail scratch tally, the number of seasons she and Thomas had made it through. She hadn't added one since he passed. Afternoon came slowly. She boiled a little rice, let it cool, and tried to spoon some into the man's mouth. Most of it dribbled out again. His chest rose and fell like the wind itself, erratic, sharp, unsure whether to stay or go. She found herself talking to him as the day stretched longer than the shadows. "You came here to die," she said. "Didn't you?" He didn't answer, just moaned softly and turned his head. She adjusted the blanket, feeling the heat radiating off him like stove bricks in winter. "I got nothing left," she added after a while. "No family, no water, no horse. Just this place and a half-dead man bleeding all over my floor." Still no answer. And yet, she didn't stop tending him. The afternoon wind picked up, rattling the shingles. She walked outside, scanning the sky again, as if she might conjure rain by the sheer stubbornness of her will. The clouds were there, thin wisps stretched too high to mean anything. She touched her fingertips to her temple. She was burning up, too, and it wasn't from fever. Inside, the man stirred again. By the time night crawled in over the hollow, she knew what she had to do. She knelt by the hearth, gathered the pouch of dried willow bark, and wrapped it with a slip of cloth torn from her wedding dress. It was one of the last things she'd kept locked away in the chest. Now it seemed fitting. She tucked it into the stranger's satchel, along with a small pouch of coins, 4 quarters, 3 dimes, 1 silver dollar with the face rubbed smooth. She hesitated. then added the silver cross her mother had given her the day she left Montgomery Parish. So long ago it might as well have been another life. The fever had not broken, but she couldn't wait. With steady hands, she dragged the man toward the porch again, bundled in the wool blanket and a second layer of burlap. She stared east for a long while, then let out a sharp whistle. The sound echoed, unanswered. No Samson, no hooves, just the wind. She swallowed, throat tight. He had to make it. If Samson didn't find help, if he didn't return. She sat down hard on the steps, eyes fixed on the ridge, mind empty. The sky above was softening, stars poking through the black, and the land felt paused, as if it, too, were waiting to see what might happen next. She rose and returned to the hearth, lit the lantern early, kept the door open longer than usual. And that night, Miriam dreamt of horses, not just one, but many, galloping in wide circling patterns through the hollow, tails like smoke, eyes like flame. They didn't come to her. They circled, waiting. When she woke, the light outside was different. The wind was cooler, the shadows longer, and there, just there, at the edge of sound, she heard it. Not birds, not wind, but hoofbeats, a rhythm, not one horse, many. She sat up, heart lurching. The Mustangs were returning, and they weren't alone. The dust settled, and Ghost Hollow was quiet again, but Miriam Delaney had never felt so exposed. The trail to the hidden spring was narrow as a whisper, and just as easily lost. The morning after the fever broke, Miriam rose with a sense of weight she hadn't known since the day Thomas was buried. Yet beneath that heaviness was something unfamiliar. Movement. Change. Like when a deep well starts to echo again after years of silence. The man, Taza, he'd said when words finally returned to him, sat outside her cabin now, legs folded beneath him, face turned east. He hadn't spoken much since waking, but his silence didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate, like the hush before a prayer. He had asked for a horse, not to leave, but to guide. There was a place, he said, that remembered water. A place few men could find, fewer still could enter. Miriam hadn't meant to go, not at first, but the drought had no mercy left, and something in Taza's eyes, something unspoken but certain, said this wasn't just about survival. It was about remembering. So she packed dried bread, the last of her salted meat, 2 tin cups, and her old revolver, though she doubted it would matter. She told herself it was just to see where he came from. Maybe understand what kind of spirit had crossed her porch in a dying wind and left her world tilting on its side. They set out before noon, when the sun was cruel, but not yet unbearable. The dun mare, Mossflower, carried them both, slow and steady across the blanched terrain. Her hooves left marks like pressed coins in the chalky earth, quickly smudged by wind. The way was unfamiliar, not just the turns, but the very feel of it. Ghost Hollow sat nestled low, but Taza led them upward. Toward crags and shale ridges Miriam hadn't walked in years, not since her husband had tried to find a second well and nearly broke his leg in the process. Twice, she asked where they were going. Twice, he said nothing, only raised a hand, palm flat, toward the peaks. She didn't speak again after that. She didn't need to. By late afternoon, they reached the entrance, a narrow crease between 2 sandstone outcrops. No trail, no markers, just a shape the sun cast at a certain hour that made one rock look like a sleeping hawk, and another like folded wings. Taza dismounted, knelt, and touched the ground with his fingers. Then, wordlessly, he led the mare forward. The air changed as soon as they passed through, not cooler, but heavier. The sound of wind softened. The scrub brush grew denser, greener. Here and there, purple thistles bloomed where none had bloomed in years. Miriam watched the way Taza moved, as if he were stepping through memory, not just stone. It took another hour to reach the spring. They came upon it slowly, like approaching a dream you fear might disappear if looked at too directly. The water wasn't wide, no lake, no pool, but it shimmered between the rocks, cool and clear, fed by a seam in the stone wall above. Small ferns grew along the edge. A narrow fall of water dripped in perfect rhythm, as if the earth itself kept time. Miriam dismounted, walked forward, then fell to her knees. Her throat tightened, her hands trembled. She hadn't seen water like this in a year and a half. Not water that didn't stink of iron, not water that moved. Taza said nothing. He just stood nearby, hands at his sides, his face as still as the rocks around them. She dipped her fingers in, then her whole hands, then splashed her cheeks, her neck, her arms. She didn't cry, not at first. But when she drank, cupped her palms and drank, she did. He waited until she was done. "This place is remembered," he said at last, voice low and sure, "even when men forget it." She nodded, unable to speak. Later, they sat beside the spring, sharing bread in silence. The breeze here carried the scent of wet stone and flowering brush. It felt sacred, not because someone had declared it so, but because it had been left untouched long enough to remember its purpose. He told her then, haltingly, that he had grown up near this place. That his people had protected it long before the cavalry, long before maps, that the herd, his herd, had once watered here during migrations. "That's why they'll return," he said. "They remember. The horses know what we forget." Miriam stared into the pool, watching her reflection ripple. "Why show me this?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes darker than the spring. "Because you gave without asking," he said. "That is the law of this place." She didn't reply, only nodded, slowly. Before they left, she stepped to the edge of the clearing where a juniper tree grew, twisted and ancient, its bark silvered with age. She pulled her carving knife from her belt, the same one she'd used to make Thomas's headstone. With slow, careful strokes, she etched a mark into the bark. Not a name, not a word, but a shape. A symbol she remembered from the corners of her grandmother's quilt. A bridge across a stream. Taza watched but said nothing. They rode back in silence. The trail no easier to follow than it had been coming in. Miriam didn't ask how he'd found it again. Some things didn't need asking. They reached Ghost Hollow at twilight. The first thing she saw was the dust, fresh, unsettled, spiraling in the distance. Riders, coming fast, not traitors, not friends. She turned toward the house, heart thudding. Behind them, a distant dust plume spiraled towards the homestead, riders coming fast, and not to trade. When strangers came to Ghost Hollow, they rarely brought blessings, only questions, and sometimes guns. The horses arrived in a fan of dust and law-colored coats, the kind that gleamed too clean for frontier work. Miriam saw the shine of brass buttons before she saw their faces. By the time she and Taza had reached the edge of the corral, the riders had already dismounted. 5 men. 2 wore cavalry uniforms. One had the star of the United States Land Authority pinned like a trophy to his chest. The last 2 looked like they belonged in the city. Tight suits, narrow boots, hands too soft to know the weight of a shovel or the bite of horse reins. Taza moved quietly to the porch, stopping a step behind Miriam. His face didn't change, but she could feel the coiling of his stillness, like a bow waiting for a draw. The tallest of the visitors stepped forward. His voice had the clipped flatness of a man used to barking orders in rooms where no one argued back. "Miriam Delaney?" She gave a slow nod, her eyes moving from man to man. "That's my name. I'm Agent Lowell Clagg, United States Land Authority. These men ride with me from Fort Calder and Washington's Indian Affairs Bureau. The other suited figure tipped his hat. Dr. Lucinda Evers, she said, her voice firmer than expected. We're here about the Mustangs. Miriam raised a brow. I haven't seen a Mustang in months. That so? Agent Clagg's lip curled in a smile that wasn't a smile. Because our reports say different. Say you're hiding a herd that don't belong to you. Behind her, Taza's silence deepened. She could feel the tension in his breath. Miriam stepped forward, crossing her arms. This land's been dying for a year and a half. What makes you think anything would stay here? Dr. Evers stepped in gently, her eyes scanning the homestead, not with suspicion, but curiosity. We received accounts of a man seen driving a group of unbranded horses east, Mustangs, strong, moving like they were led. And? Miriam's voice stayed steady. Evers hesitated. They weren't seen again, until now. One of the cavalrymen stepped to the side, revealing what had been tied behind their horses, a canvas-draped bundle. Miriam's gut clenched. A hoof poked from beneath the tarp. She didn't speak. Agent Clegg leaned in. This horse bore your mark, Miss Delaney, and unless I'm mistaken, the man riding him was described as an Apache. Miriam's jaw stiffened. She kept her gaze level. That horse was dying on my land before he arrived. He helped it live. That's not what the report says. What report? Clegg smiled again, broader now, teeth too white. The one I'm writing. Taza stepped forward then, calm, not defiant, not afraid. He held out a folded paper from within his shirt, yellowed, stamped with a seal. Dr. Evers took it. Her brow furrowed as she read, then raised it to the light. She looked at Taza. This is real? Taza nodded once. Treaty provision. Article 32. Recognition of sacred passage and traditional stewardship. Article 32 hasn't been enforced since men like him, Taza said, tilting his chin toward Clegg, started burying it. Evers turned to Clegg. This predates your jurisdiction. Clegg bristled. That paper's a relic. It's law, she said quietly. The standoff stretched. Then the Mustangs appeared, sudden and silent as smoke, cresting the rise behind the homestead. A dozen strong, not corralled. Not tied, just there, watching. Clagg's men froze. Evers stared. Taza stepped forward, his voice low but sharp. You chase wild horses with fences and ink, but they remember places better than men do, and they came back. The Mustangs didn't move. Dust swirled between their legs. Brimstone, the stallion, stood at the center, his eyes like burnished coal, ears twitching but calm. Miriam didn't speak. She didn't need to. The wind did that now. Clegg turned red. This is nonsense. They've been lured, trained. This is theft. No, Evers said, raising her voice. This is history returning. These horses, they're bloodlines. They're ancient. Look at the way they group. Defensive. Tribal. Clegg spat in the dirt. You'll regret harboring a fugitive, he said, eyes fixed on Miriam. She held his gaze, unmoved. I've already regretted worse. He turned sharply. Mount up. The cavalrymen hesitated, but obeyed. Dr. Evers lingered. You should be careful, she said softly. Men like him don't like to lose. Miriam offered the smallest nod. As the dust of their departure settled, Taza turned to her. They'll come back, she said. He nodded. She reached down, brushed her fingers across Brimstone's neck as he approached the porch without prompting. Let them, she said. Taza said nothing, but behind them, the herd shifted, watching, waiting. You came looking for horses, Taza said quietly. But what you found is truth, and that's harder to ride away from. The silence after a confrontation is louder than gunfire. especially when justice only half settles the dust. The riders were gone, their tracks etched into the earth like warnings carved by boot heels and lawmen's pride. Miriam watched the road long after the dust had settled, arms crossed against the evening wind that whistled through the porch beams. The mustangs had retreated again to the ridge, as if sensing they were safer in the twilight than under the scrutiny of men with pens and rifles. Taza stood by the corral, head bowed slightly, not in submission, but in mourning. For something unspoken, for what nearly was. She brought him water. He took it with a nod, and together they sat without speaking as dusk slipped into the bones of the land. The quiet between them had grown comfortable now, familiar, even necessary, but it wasn't going to last. That night, she opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, one she hadn't touched since Thomas's death. Inside, beneath the folded linens and the quilt she'd never finished, lay the leather-bound ledger Thomas kept during the early days of the ranch. It was thick with entries, sales, trades, bartering agreements made with locals and travelers alike. More importantly, tucked in the final pages were letters. Correspondence with a man named Lieutenant Arlen Howe, dated the spring of 1879. They'd once discussed registering the wild horse migration trails across Dry Cedar Bluff for preservation, for shared use. But the project had never moved forward. The final letter bore no reply. Taza read through them slowly by lantern light, eyes narrowing. "You said he was fair," he murmured. "Your husband." "He tried to be. But fairness doesn't always survive long out here." "Where is this man now?" She shook her head. "Gone east? Or underground? The letter's 15 years old." But the name lit something in Taza's eyes. "I know that name," he said. "Howe sat at the treaty table with my uncle. He was supposed to return. He never did." They sat in silence, the lantern flickering between them. It became clear what had to be done. If Clagg and the others were going to build a case against her, or worse, fabricate one, they would not stop. Paper and politics were as sharp as blades, and those men wielded them well. But if they could find Lieutenant Howe, or proof of what had been promised, they might force the truth back into daylight. "I'll go," Taza said. "No," Miriam said, standing. "We go together." And so it was settled. They packed at dawn. She wore Thomas's duster and tucked the ledger into her satchel. Taza carried the carved staff he had brought back from the sacred spring, a mark of memory as much as guidance. The mustangs watched them depart, silent sentinels in the morning haze. The ride east toward Copper Creek was long and mean. Dust rose like ghosts from the dry earth, and the land itself seemed to whisper old warnings with each mile. But the two of them rode in tandem, strangers no longer, tied now not by accident, but purpose. By the second day, the land began to change. Trees thickened. The sky darkened early with a promise of distant storms. They passed old boundary stones and rusted fence posts half swallowed by brush. At dusk, they camped near an abandoned way station. Its walls collapsed, but its chimneys still good for blocking wind. That night, Miriam unrolled the ledger and reread the entries under firelight. She pointed to one scrawled line in faded ink. "Document shared with Howe. Terms of pasture exchange to be witnessed under formal review." Taza studied it. "This proves it existed." She exhaled, the weight of old years curling through her lungs. The next morning, they reached Copper Creek, a town barely alive, but not yet dead. A few storefronts, a saloon with one broken shutter, a post office that leaned sideways but still bore a brass nameplate. Inside, they asked after Howe. The old postmaster, a woman named Cora with steel in her spine and no patience for flattery, took one look at the ledger and turned pale. "I remember Howe," she said. "He was decent. Sent letters from here every week. One day he just stopped coming. Never said goodbye." Left a file behind, though. She dug beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers and unearthed a wooden lockbox. Inside were 3 sealed envelopes and a folded map. Miriam unfolded the parchment with trembling fingers. It bore the same symbol carved at the spring, the arch over the stream. "This is it," she whispered. A stamp in the corner bore the date, 1880. Before she could speak again, the door behind them creaked. Agent Clegg stood there, alone, hat in his hand, gun at his hip. He smiled like a snake that had just remembered how to strike. "I thought you might come sniffing here," he said. "And now I've got you both. On record. With stolen documents." Taza stepped forward, but Miriam laid a hand on his arm. "Not stolen," she said. "Recovered." Clagg's hand hovered near his holster. Then another voice echoed from the doorway behind him. "You'll want to think twice about drawing, son." An older man stepped in, tall, grizzled, dressed in a Union blue coat faded nearly gray. Lieutenant Arlen Howe. Clegg turned, stunned. "You." "Still breathing," Howe said. "Still carrying copies of every letter I ever sent." Miriam felt her knees go weak. "You never answered," she said. "I did," Howe said, stepping past Clegg. "But someone stopped my letters. Someone didn't want peace to hold." He turned to Clegg. "And that someone's bosses are going to have a hell of a time explaining this." Clegg didn't move. Taza stepped forward and held out the treaty page. "Remember this?" Howe took it and nodded. "Let's go make it public," he said. They walked out together, the air behind them heavy with something that almost felt like justice. But as they reached the horses, Miriam saw the glint of metal from the ridge above town. Not a badge, not a spyglass, a rifle. Aimed. Waiting. Her hand went instinctively to her revolver, but it was too late. The shot rang out, and everything tilted. The sound of a rifle cracking through canyon air is different from that of a pistol. It lingers, folds into the wind, and waits to be remembered. Miriam hit the ground first, instinct drawn from 1,000 farm chores and one too many foxes in the henhouse. Dust rose like smoke as she rolled behind the water trough, heart slamming against her ribs. Taza had leapt the other way, dragging Howe with him, just as the second shot split the corner post of the post office behind them. No one screamed. There wasn't time for fear, only reflex. Clegg didn't flinch. That was the strange part. He stood in the middle of the street, watching, not ducking, not calling out, just watching the ridge like a man counting off a debt. Miriam's mind sharpened, tracking the sound. High ridge, south slope. One rifle, maybe 2. Precision. Snipers. Not amateurs. "Stay down," she called. But her voice was swallowed by the canyon wind and the echo of one more shot, this one striking the edge of the saloon's second-story balcony. Howe cursed beside her. His leg was bleeding, but not deep. Grazed, not pierced. Lucky. Taza moved low across the alley between the sheriff's house and the stables, fluid as a shadow, making for the back entrance of the mercantile. He didn't need to be told what to do. He knew ambushes. He had grown up under the weight of them. Clegg turned then, casually, and strolled toward the boardwalk, not running, not hiding, which meant one thing. He'd expected this. Miriam bit back her fury and focused. Her revolver lay holstered at her back, but she didn't draw yet. Not until she knew where the next shot would come from. Then it came, sharp and deliberate, aimed low to flush someone from hiding. But no one moved. That's when the townsfolk began to peek out. Not many, but enough. A boy from the mill house, 2 old men from the saloon. The preacher's widow from behind her garden gate. Ghost Hollow was no Copper Creek, but even this town had eyes, and they were watching now. It changed something. Clegg noticed it too. His stride faltered. He glanced toward the ridge, and for the first time, his fingers twitched toward his sidearm. Hal saw it and stood, even with the blood dripping down his shin. "Don't do it," he said. Clag didn't answer. Taza emerged then, flanking from behind the mercantile, rifle in hand, not raised, but ready. The balance shifted in an instant. Miriam rose slowly from her cover. "You tried to kill us," she said. Her voice did not shake. Clag smirked. "No, I just didn't stop someone else from doing it." "That's the same thing," she said. Behind her, the townsfolk were stepping farther into view. Not armed, but present. That too was a kind of weapon. Howe took a breath. "I'm calling for federal review," he said. "This whole operation's dirty. And your name's going on the first page." Clag looked from one face to the next, then to the ridgeline, and then he did the only thing left to him. He ran. Taza moved first, feet silent across the gravel. Miriam followed without thinking. Behind her, two of the townsfolk raised rusty rifles, not in use, but in warning. The chase didn't last long. They cornered him at the edge of the freight yard, where the canyon narrowed and the cliffs turned steep. He turned too fast on loose shale and fell hard. Leg twisted beneath him. His pistol skittered across the rocks. Miriam picked it up. He looked up at her then, breathing ragged, hate still curling in the corners of his mouth. "I was cleaning this place," he said. "Keeping order." "You were burying the past," she replied. "And the past remembers." Howe caught up, breath short but steady. Taza stood over Clag, silent as ever. "We'll need to hold him," Howe said. "Long enough for the marshals to arrive." Miriam handed over the pistol, and with that, the worst had passed. But it wasn't over. 2 days later, in the shade of the old livery barn, the papers were signed. Howe formally recognized the trail as a protected heritage corridor under the old treaty statutes. With Lucinda Evers returning to verify the horse's genetics, and Miriam providing the land and leadership, the government had no choice but to support the program. A new beginning. The wild horses would be studied, bred, and their line preserved, but not broken. Apache herders would be given first stewardship. Miriam's land would serve as the heart of it all. And the spring would be guarded by the people who remembered it best. The town shifted around her, slowly. Men who once ignored her now tipped their hats. Women brought bread and stories. The hollow began to hum again, not loud, but steady. At the edge of the corral, Miriam stood with Taza, watching Brimstone lead the herd in lazy circles through the pasture. "We should name this place," she said. Taza looked to the ridge, then back to her. "We already did," he said. "We just forgot." The wind caught the barn flag then, snapping once. In the distance, hoofbeats echoed again. New riders arriving. Not enemies. Visitors. The land was no longer silent, and neither was she. There's something about the sound of wind in dry grass that makes a soul remember things it never meant to forget, like the way horse hooves echo on hard-packed dirt just after a summer storm, or how the last light of dusk always paints the sky in the same forgiving shade of fire. The land out there remembers more than we ever give it credit for. Hoofprints that faded, hands that prayed by empty wells, a mother's humming lullaby drifting through cracked doorways long after the baby grew up and rode away. Some places hold grief so deep, the ground itself feels softer, as if it too mourned the ones who never came back. And some women, like Miriam Delaney, carry those sorrows the way others carry rifles. Quiet, but ready. You might not recall every word spoken by the fire, or the names carved into ledger paper, or even the old soldier's voice when he stood between law and mercy, but you'll remember the hush of the horses standing in the fog, the way their ears turned before they moved, how their breath steamed in the morning cold, like ghosts rising to remind you they never truly left. You'll remember the carved staff leaning by the cabin door, the woven symbol sewn into the hem of a blanket too worn to sell, and how the lantern light caught the brass button on a coat that hadn't been worn since before the railroad came through. Because that's what truth does in the West. It doesn't shout. It lingers. It hangs in the twilight, in letters that were never mailed, in treaties signed with trembling hands beneath the cottonwoods, in handkerchiefs embroidered by women whose names don't appear in history books. And justice, when it does come, doesn't always ride in on a stallion with thunder behind it. It might come as a signature in a barn office, a child watching a wild colt take its first trembling steps, or a woman standing alone at the edge of her field, finally hearing the land answer back. Folks used to say that honor died with the old ways, but the wind still carries its scent if you know when to breathe deep. Kindness might look like stubbornness at first. Mercy might wear the face of a man who never raises his voice. And sometimes, the forgotten woman, left with nothing but a leaking roof, an old rifle, and a scarred heart. The one who still knew how to keep a lantern lit when others had forgotten the path. There are stories that fade like ash, and others that root deep, like mesquite. This one holds, because the truth doesn't need a crowd to stand. It just needs one soul brave enough to keep it warm, to tend it through the drought, and to whisper it back to life when the time is right. If you felt the dust of this tale settle in your chest, if your fingers itched for old paper and your heart stirred like it hadn't in a while, then maybe you're one of the ones who still believes that justice, though late, is never wasted. That forgiveness is a kind of strength. That what's buried in the desert doesn't always stay lost. Sometimes it rises, green and fierce, like wildflowers after rain. If this story moved something quiet in you, go on and leave a sign. A single one is enough. And if you want to walk with us a little farther down this old trail, saddle up and subscribe to our channel, where the next tale waits just beyond the bend. The past ain't gone, friend. It's just waiting for the right voice to remember it.